Okay, everybody, welcome. Getting ready to start again. I've been told I have permission to take my mask off as long as I'm by myself up here, so you guys can actually see me. I know I always have a hard time listening to people. I always feel bad at a podium talking with a mask because it's hard enough, we're far away, and to try to guess my expression by what you can see of my eyes above my mask, I know it's really hard. So welcome. If for those of you who came to my last panel, I would love to answer questions that you guys have. So I'm not going to just talk for a really long time and then open it up for questions. I'm happy to take questions as we go, and I would love to make that a significant part of things. So, but we can't bring the mic to you, so you have to come to the mic, unfortunately, if you want to ask a question. Or perhaps you can send a representative to ask your question up to the mic. But in any case, all right, so welcome to a Tolkien anime. What to expect. So there is, in fact, an anime adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, well, the Lord of the Rings world anyway, coming to theaters in 2024. Prospective release date is April 12th, 2024. So we are 13 months away from the release of the new Tolkien anime. So what exactly is this? What's going on? How does it fit in with other things? You may have heard recently, there was a news story recently that was circulating that was talking about new Lord of the Rings movies coming on the way, and lots of people have been asking about that and saying, oh, what's going on? I have to admit that when that story broke, it did not strike me as news at all, actually. I'm like, we know that there are new Lord of the Rings movies. It's already been announced there are new movies coming. We've been waiting for this. So to kind of recap the situation, I talked about a bit at the end of my last panel, which was on the Rings of Power. And here's the situation in the world of Tolkien adaptation that we are looking towards over the next 10 years or so. And that is that there are two different groups, basically, that have staked their claims in the Tolkien adaptation world. The rights to streaming television adaptations of Tolkien is owned by Amazon Prime Video. The Rings of Power is the first, and I suspect will not be the only one of those to be released. And I would suspect that there may be more of them even prior to the end of the Rings of Power run. I would not be surprised to see spin-offs there. On the other hand, the film rights to Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit were recently up for sale. As perhaps many of you know, they were purchased by the Embracer Group, and which is of course a major gaming group. And one of the things that we Tolkien geeks sitting back and looking at this and talking to each other, were really interested to see was whether Amazon was going to move to monopolize this, since the movie rights were openly for sale. And they did not. They did not choose to do that. And so as a result, we now have two separate, independent, and rival groups, one of whom has the film rights, and the other of whom has the TV rights. And both of them, I believe, based on conversations I've had with the Amazon people, I believe that the reason that Prime Video did not buy the film rights when they were up for sale, why they did not outbid Embracer for the film rights, who paid a lot for them, but not that much. It wasn't a crazy amount of money, if hundreds of billions of dollars could be called not crazy, but in any case, but still, it sold for less than Star Wars did, is what I'm saying. Clearly Amazon could have afforded it had they wanted to outbid Embracer for that, but they chose not to, because they don't believe in feature films. They believe that streaming television is the future of entertainment, at least the immediate future of entertainment, and they're not that interested in feature films. So, now we have two different things which are both going to be producing new Tolkien adaptation content, sort of vying for the attention of Tolkien fans. And I'm kind of excited about that, actually. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I think that there's probably going to be some content that's not that good, and there will be some that will be much better. And I'm just going to be interested to see what they come up with. So, in my last session, I was looking at the one side of this rumble, and that is the Rings of Power from Prime Video. Now I want to talk about the War of the Rohirrim, which is the first of the other side that is coming out, the first new feature film adaptation of Tolkien, which is, of course, being produced in conjunction. Now, it's being produced by Warner Brothers and New Line Cinema, but it's being produced in conjunction with Sola Digital Arts from Japan as well. Sola Digital Arts did Blade Runner, Black Lotus, and Ghost in the Shell. I don't know if anybody knows those productions, but anyway. So the director is Kenji Kamiyama. Again, he's done a bunch of anime productions. So we have this cooperative effort that is being released next year. What are they doing exactly? Well, the story that we're getting in this movie is going to be a flashback story. So again, when people were putting out news articles talking about new Lord of the Rings stuff, I have heard nothing and don't see any reason to think they're going to do just like a reboot of the Lord of the Rings films or something like that. Some people said, are they going to do a sequel? And I'm like, I doubt they're going to do a sequel. There might be some later stories that could be done, but most likely is in the direction that the War of the Rohirrim is, which is sort of interesting standalone stories that Tolkien either wrote or outlined, which take place historically, which take place earlier than the Lord of the Rings. So the War of the Rohirrim takes place a few hundred years prior to the events of the Lord of the Rings. It details one of the most colorful incidents in the history of Rohan. So if you like the Rohirrim in the Lord of the Rings films, you'll get much more of them, of course, here, as we're going to be focusing on one of the major things from their history, which is the story of Helm Hammerhand, which is a really interesting story for them to choose to tell in a lot of ways. I find it interesting in many ways that they're choosing this story. So you remember in the Lord of the Rings films, you remember the battle at Helm's Deep, right? When Theoden and the men of Rohan are trapped in the fortress at Helm's Deep, and the Orc army is attacking, and Legolas shield surfs, and everyone is saved eventually, right? That battle takes place. So basically, we're going historically back from that. That place is called Helm's Deep. Helm's Deep is not the castle is the Hornburg. The Helm's Deep means that whole canyon area, which is named after Helm Hammerhand, who was a king of Rohan earlier on. And the place was named after him because he had a horn which he would blow, and he would blow it so loudly that it would echo in the canyon, and people could hear it from really, really far away. He was very famous for this. And so the location was called Helm's Deep. And the story, there's a lot of political intrigue in this story. The character of Helm Hammerhand, as Tolkien depicts it, he tells this story not in full. He doesn't talk a full novella-length version of it or something like that. But he sketches this story with some interesting details and incidents in Appendix A of The Return of the King. So you can find the whole story that Tolkien wrote of it there. Helm Hammerhand is huge. He's this huge, burly guy. He's king, and he gets disrespected by one of his nobles. And then he calls him out, like he literally takes him outside after. He's like, we'll talk about this later outside. They're having a meeting of his things. And he takes him out into the snow afterwards. And he says, now we can finish this. And he punches him in the face and kills him with one punch. And he's like, there we go. We finished our conversation, right? Helm Hammerhand. So he's called Hammerhand because he's so huge and his fists are like hammers. Unfortunately, that guy has a son who takes this amiss, and he the thing that he was being dissed about Helm was that this guy Freyka, his son Wolf, wanted to marry Helm's daughter. And Helm was not into that. So anyway. The son, Wolf, ends up rebelling and joining with the Dunlendings nearby to besiege Rohan. They invade Rohan in the middle of the Fell Winter, which is the worst winter on record. It's a kind of a big deal in a whole bunch of different places. And the Long Winter. And Helm ends up having to take refuge in Helm's Deep. And he is trapped there, and they're besieged. They can't get into the Hornburg. They're besieged there. And Helm and his soldiers are starting to starve to death in the winter, as the winter is unrelenting, and they can't escape, and there can't be no relief can come to them. And eventually, Helm, because he's Helm and he's awesome, sneaks out alone at night to go into the camp of his enemies and just kill people with his bare hands. Because he can. And it is said, we are told in Appendix A, that if he fought without weapons, no weapon could damage him. Now, super nerdy literature trivia of who else was that true in medieval literature? Does anybody happen to know? Very obscure.
Not Hercules.
No, it's like Hercules. That kind of invulnerability is sort of like or like Achilles, right? It's like that.
Cuchulainn?
I like that too. The specific, like, if he fights without a weapon, then no weapon can affect him. That very specific conditional clause. It's Grendel from Beowulf. No, it's Grendel from Beowulf. Grendel, yeah. This is why it's a big deal that Beowulf defeats him barehanded, right? He rips his arm off. He wasn't immune to that, right? So it's really interesting that Helm Hammerhand, the hero of Rohan, Tolkien deliberately parallels him with Grendel, the monster of Beowulf. Really fascinating. And then legends begin to circulate among the Dunlendings that Helm Hammerhand, when he comes out, takes men and eats them. Takes them and brings them home and eats them raw to feed his troops. And he always blows his horn, but he doesn't even sneak out. He blows his horn and then goes out by himself into the camp. But they're so terrified of it, whenever the horn blows, they run away. And then they come back to keep the siege up. And finally, what kills Helm? No one knows what kills Helm. He goes out one night and he doesn't come back. And the next day, his men find him standing on a hill, looking out over his enemies. Dead. Standing dead. Frozen in the cold. And they just leave him there. Staring out. The story of Helm Hammerhand is really metal. Really metal. It's a fascinating choice for them to tell that story. Eventually, of course, his nephew, his sister's son, Freyadoth, who took refuge during the Long Winter in Dunharrow, where the Paths of the Dead are, you may remember. He was up there. When the spring finally comes, he comes out and he recaptures Rohan from Wolf and sets himself back up as king and becomes the heir of Helm, and the line of the kings of Rohan continues. There's going to be political intrigue, there's going to be betrayals, there's going to be hostile takeovers of the kingdom of Rohan, there's going to be long sieges. I doubt anyone will be eaten raw. There will probably be people punched to death in the face. I am not really sure how they're going to be spinning this. But here's there are a couple kind of big picture things that we can see from this. One is the overall approach that they're taking to doing more Lord of the Rings films. And that is, and I think it's a brilliant approach. Instead of trying to do, think of what because this of course is being done by, Warner Brothers and New Line Cinema. It's associated with the Peter Jackson group. Peter Jackson is not involved directly in this film, though I understand Philippa Boyens was a consultant for it. But it's basically being done by the Peter Jackson group. Think about how the Peter Jackson group went with their movies, right? First you have the Lord of the Rings films, which were just these spectacular, enormous, epic scope films. And then they did the Hobbit films, which were not good films, but they were ambitious films. They ended up being silly films, but they were ambitious. What I loved about the Hobbit films, and that's not a sentence I say very often, is the concept of the Hobbit films. I always found the Hobbit films more or less tragic because the Hobbit films were a failure to execute a really, really good idea. And the good idea that I'm talking about, Tolkien wrote The Hobbit. And he wrote The Hobbit a long time before he wrote The Lord of the Rings. And when he wrote The Hobbit, the story itself grew by the end. The end of that story is very different from the beginning of that story. It becomes a much bigger, much more serious story. But then when he writes the sequel, when he comes back to it and writes The Lord of the Rings, the story then grows even more and it incorporates The Hobbit. But The Hobbit, it's really a standalone fairy tale thing. There are a lot of continuity problems between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings because when he wrote The Hobbit, Tolkien wasn't doing the kind of really serious, detailed world building that he would do later on. He was like, The Hobbit is like a fun little bucket of Tolkien's favorite tropes and stories, right? He's like, I'm going to take, some dwarves from Old Norse poems, and I'm going to throw in my favorite dragon from Norse mythology, and I'm going to throw in some Beowulf, and I'm going to throw in a whole bunch of stuff from those poems and stories that I've written that nobody will publish, and I'm going to put it, and it's going to be awesome, right? Plus eagles. Who doesn't like it? And bears. Dancing bears, right? Dancing bears. Dancing bears, a surprisingly persistent theme in Tolkien. We just learned, we, meaning the world, just learned to our never-ending delight about the great tradition of the mighty dancing bears of the Isle of Numenor. This is in The Nature of Middle-earth, which was just released a year ago, September. And oh man, the Dancing Bears of Numenor, favorite chapter in that whole book. So anyway, like they every year, the Bears of Numenor spontaneously gather together for a huge bear dance party. And the one thing you mustn't do, the one thing you can do to anger the Dancing Bears of Numenor, it's perfectly safe to go watch them, unless you laugh. If you laugh at them, they will eviscerate you. Come on, this is awesome. I need a whole movie on the Dancing Bears of Numenor, frankly. But anyway, so he throws all this stuff together in The Hobbit, right? And then he writes The Lord of the Rings. And it's not just that he wrote the second story, and it's not just that it was a bigger story, but in the course of it, he starts doing all this world building. It becomes this huge, big, continuous thing. He connects it back to his early mythologies, the Silmarillion material he'd been working on before. And it becomes this whole thing, and now, afterwards, in like the 1950s, after The Lord of the Rings published, Tolkien's looking at The Hobbit, and he's saying to himself, in retrospect, that's a bit of an eyesore now, right? This like funny hodgepodge I put together, that funny hodgepodge children's story. Something he didn't like The Hobbit, but it didn't really fit. It didn't really work. It wasn't really a naturalized citizen in the Middle-earth world that he had come to create. So Tolkien wanted to rewrite The Hobbit, to bring it into the world of The Lord of the Rings, to really kind of reconcile it with The Lord of the Rings. And actually he started rewriting The Hobbit in 1960. He got through the first 3 chapters. They're not good. the first 3 chapters of the 1960 Hobbit, it's like, imagine the first 3 chapters of The Hobbit with everything fun removed. That's pretty much the 1960 Hobbit. It's like really serious and grim. And it's like, no, I really miss the fun narrator. But anyway, his dream was to go back and integrate, to retell The Hobbit as a chapter of the bigger story, to really show how that fits with the Lord of the Rings and how it led to the Lord of the Rings. And that's exactly what Peter Jackson and company set out to do in the Hobbit films, which is great. What a wonderful idea. And what horribly disappointing execution that was. But again, so notice they're going sort of bigger and bigger, right? Let's take the Lord of the Rings, let's do the Lord of the Rings big. Let's take the Hobbit, let's make it big too. Right, let's do the big version of The Hobbit. And now what are they doing? Now they're going small, right? Or rather, they're going short. Let's take one story that Tolkien wrote, that he outlined in just a few pages, and let's really dig into that small story, that short story, and make a movie out of that. I think that's a fantastic approach, and that's what I am expecting to see from not only from this but from future films from the Lord of the Rings that we're from this Lord of the Rings group, that we're going to be continuing to get these sort of episodic things. Are they going to connect together? Are we going to see this sort of network of stories? Are we going to get like the Middle-earth cinematic universe? I don't know, but I'm down for that if that's what we get, right? I want to see the adventures of young Aragorn. There's a lot of stories from Appendix A. You can mine Appendix A for quite some time in getting really fun stories from the old days, like the Arnorian civil wars and the Witch King overthrowing them and Glorfindel prophesying the doom of the Witch King on them. Oh man, come on! There's lots of stuff that you can do there. I think it could be really cool. So this seems to be the direction that they're going in, these kinds of fill-in-the-blank stories, to take these really cool story concepts that Tolkien mentions, especially in his appendices, the appendices to the Lord of the Rings, and filling them out and telling us really full stories. So I think that that's going to be fascinating. A couple issues that I think are going to be interesting here. One, which I think could tell us a lot about what this film, what future films are likely to be, is how they frame this film. I believe there's going to be an actual storytelling frame of this. Because, of course, many people are very excited to hear there's been a bunch of the casting, the voice actors casting of this film. A lot of that has been announced. But there was one that really jumped out at everybody, of course, and that's Miranda Otto, who played Éowyn in the Lord of the Rings films, has been cast in this. But not only has she been cast in this, she is cast in this voicing Éowyn. And I believe what that means is that we are going to get a storytelling frame. That this story of Helm Hammerhand is going to be delivered as Éowyn telling the story of Helm Hammerhand, like to her and Faramir's kids in Ithilien, which is a really cool frame. Like that's kind of like old, mommy Éowyn telling stories to her kids. I'm okay with that. That's really cool. And so again, so to see how that frame and what kind of, and especially how the frame ends, like are we going to hint at other stories, right? Are we going to be, is this just the first of a series of bedtime stories we're going to receive? That would be cool. Even just within the history of Rohan, even within, Éowyn telling stories from Rohirrim tradition, there are several films that could easily be made on that, which would be great, great fun. And this in its own way also seems to me to provide an interesting context for their choice to make this an animated film as well. Of course, one of the elements of an animated film instead of a live-action film is to some extent a decrease in the immediacy, right? Like you're not like right there, you're seeing it all unfold. there's that sort of more explicit dimension of the artistic representation of the story, right? That is kind of deliberately putting itself between us and the action. Again, not in the way that we're kind of brought into Bag End, right? And invited to imagine that we're there in the Peter Jackson films. And that seems to me to really fit the storytelling premise, which they seem to be working off of that. Maybe that's not exactly what they're doing, but it's what it seems like they're doing. And I think that's going to be really, really cool, really fun to see. There are other questions I have about this story, and then I'm happy to take questions from you guys too. But there's one that I will anticipate, because I really don't know what they're going to do with this. Not only is the story of Helm Hammerhand grim and strange, it also is one of the most prominent stories from the history of Rohan that deals with one of the most challenging and problematic elements of the history of Rohan. One of the things that makes Tolkien fans kind of uncomfortable about the history of Rohan. And that is the quasi-imperialistic relationship between them and the Dunlendings. The story of Rohan, as we're told in Appendix A, is that there was this land that technically belonged to Gondor. It was part of Gondor's domain, but not that many people lived there. Not many Gondorian people lived there, anyway. So when Eorl the Young comes down and rescues the armies of Gondor, they say, hey, you need a new kingdom? We've got this great country for you. What will come to be known as Rohan? And they live there, except there are other people there already who are displaced by the Rohirrim, the Dunlendings. And the Dunlendings are displaced and they move out across the fords of Isen. And there's much tension. The Dunlendings at the time of the Lord of the Rings remember being thrown out of their homeland by the Rohirrim. And there are many uncomfortable echoes here, right? Whether it makes people think uncomfortably about the displacement of native tribes in North America, or whether it makes people think uncomfortably about Israel and Palestine. There are all kinds of ways in which the relationship between Rohan and Dunland and the Dunlendings is uncomfortable. I'm not saying that the situation Tolkien describes is exactly like that, but these issues come up all the time. It's hard not to think about this and at least try to figure out what exactly is Tolkien saying about how that went down and what that means in the modern day and what are the implications of all that. This is certainly a question that a lot of people have when they read this stuff. And right in the middle of this, one of the biggest stories is the Helm Hammerhand story. Because the nobleman whom Helm punches to death is of Dunlending blood. He's mixed blood, Rohirrim and Dunlending. And so his son Wolf is not only just leading an internal rebellion against Helm Hammerhand, he is also leading an army of Dunlendings who are taking that opportunity, who are allied with Wolf, who is related to the Dunlendings, who are taking that opportunity to reclaim their land, which then gets thwarted when Freyalof comes back and restores the land to the Rohirrim and kicks the Dunlendings back out again. I mean, you can see how problematic this all is, right? That's the history as it's outlined briefly in Appendix A of the Lord of the Rings. What are they going to do with this in this film? This has got to be, I think, a major issue that they're thinking through in the writing of this story and the making of this film. There are a lot of really fun ways in which an adaptation gives you an opportunity to explore, to redefine, even to ask what if about published stories. And I have no idea how they're going to treat this. But this is very high on my list of things that I'm just like, show me. What exactly are you doing with Dunland and the Dunlendings in this movie? So that I know is one of the things that I am most interested to see. And a question I think they are they're biting off a lot in making this film. And what are they going to make of that is something I'm very curious about. What questions do you guys have about this film, about sort of the directions the films are going, about other stories that may be following in the line of this to come, about the anime roots of this as well. The kind of the direction that they're going with this sort of the partnership with a Japanese anime studio that they've established. There's a lot here. I can't promise I haven't answered every question because there's a lot we don't know yet, and they're still being pretty closed mouthed about this. But yeah.
This is just a real small one, out of curiosity. Do we know the animation style? Like, is it going to be traditional? Is it going to be CGI? Is it going to be Ralph Bakshi? Like,
part of me thinks it would be awesome for it to be just like Ralph Bakshi. But it's a very small part, admittedly. I doubt that. But for instance, I suspect that at least some people in the film will wear pants. That's a prediction. But unlike in Ralph Bakshi, where pants just seem not in fashion for some reason. But we don't know. I have seen nothing. They're keeping that really, really close. All the time. It's like, we're approaching a year out. I keep expecting, give us a still, something, like show us what, it's one of the big questions. And the only thing people have to go on is the other stuff produced by the studio.
Yeah, Black Lotus is CGI, and I know the newest Ghost in the Shell is CGI, so I would assume that would be where they were going. But I think the original Ghost in the Shell is gritty, like that animation would work really well, as opposed to CGI. Just always seems like a little bit empty to me, whereas Lord of the Rings is something that it's all about the vastness, and the Peter Jackson films are all about these intricate details that you put in. I think if you were to do traditional animation with that, it would be beautiful.
Disney used to be a good animation studio too. CGI messed everything up.
Yeah, I know a lot of people have strong opinions about CGI versus traditional animation. It's a huge question. I would, if I have to guess, no, I'm not even guessing. What I'm expecting is probably CGI. That's my expectation. And in part, I think, because they would want, I suspect that they would favor something that they could flesh out into a fuller, even 3D, sort of realized CGI world, rather than a traditional, 2D animation approach. But they might surprise me. I think either could be okay, but we are all very eagerly awaiting stills to be dropped. Yeah.
So what you said about how this story can be pretty problematic given the colonialist nature of the founding of Rohan.
Yes.
I think that's actually pretty emblematic of something that I've noticed in Tolkien, which is that he was very ahead of his time in the sense that he knew that in the future people would be drawn more towards morally gray characters and people who like characters that are not absolute good and evil, because you do have Paragon and Anathema in the form of Aragorn and Gandalf and then Sauron and Saruman, but you also have a lot of characters who are a deep mixed bag. Yeah. And those are the ones that people keep coming back to. It's the reason why you will find, if you go on AO3, you will find a lot more Boromir content than Aragorn content. And Tolkien realized that stories are going away from black and white, and I think that's why it's a really good idea they chose this story, is because it is by its very nature, morally gray.
Enormously gray, yeah, all over the place for sure. Yeah, it's funny because it has been, people have been saying about Tolkien from the beginning. You know, Tolkien is very black and white, right? You know, his characters are either very, very good or very, very, you know, completely evil, and there are no shades of gray. And here's a funny story. When the Fellowship of the Ring and the Two Towers were published, and The Hobbit too, but when the Fellowship of the Ring and the Two Towers were published, C.S. Lewis, author and friend of Tolkien, wrote a review for the Time supplement of the Lord of the Rings, and you can read Lewis's reviews of the Fellowship of the Ring and the Two Towers. One of the things that he says in his Two Towers review, he says, now, some people, when they read the Fellowship of the Ring, said that, you know, all of the characters are either really white or really black. And then C.S. Lewis says, well, fortunately, now that the Two Towers has been released, no one will ever say that again. I see what he meant, right? But of course, perhaps what he should have said is, nobody who actually reads Tolkien will say that again, because Tolkien is in fact remarkably good at not only depicting characters in shades of gray, but showing the steps by which good guys end up doing horrible things with good intentions all along the way. Boromir, of course, is a classic example of this. Saruman is an example of this. Denethor is a tragic example of this. He's very, very nuanced in how he handles those kinds of characters. And even some of the characters who are the whitest, morally speaking, right? Like Gandalf the White, right? How did he get that information out of Gollum again? I put the fear of fire in him, he says, because time was short and I had to be harsh. What did that look like on the ground? Exactly, Gandalf, right? So, you know, there are, even there are moments, right? There are moments. But yeah, so, and you're right, even sort of culturally, another thing Tolkien has been sort of accused of. Many people will be like, so he's very imperialist, right? He's very, and many people will say this generously, like he was he's a product of his time, and he was still, brought out the British Empire and all that sort of thing. But no, Empire is a very troubling thing everywhere it happens in Tolkien. Look at the history of Numenor. As they increase in power and their empire increases, they go from visiting Middle-earth and being the generous teachers and gift givers. We have more advanced technology we want to share with people of Middle-earth and help, teach them how to rotate their crops and make their lives better. To let us go and levy tribute upon them. We're, giving you things, and you should pay us for that in appreciation. To finally enslaving them and bringing them back to Numenor in chains. To finally subjecting them to human sacrifice. So, he did not pull punches about what happens with empires and empire building and what that looks like. And again, shows that whole process pretty clearly. So yes, he was very much interested, again, not only in, sometimes in modern stories, you find characters who seem to be gray for the sake of being gray. Right? Like, I embrace moral ambiguity. Like, I am both good and evil at the same time, and that's how I choose to be, right? Tolkien doesn't do that sort of thing very well. What he's very interested in is the progress. There is a sense, of course, in which there are blacks and whites in Tolkien, in the sense of what the moral principles are. Like, there's no question, like, these things, some things are right, and some things are wrong. And he doesn't call that into question. But the people themselves, nobody ever is completely in one camp. Remember that, Elrond says even Sauron was not evil in the beginning. And this, of course, is also very strongly dramatized in Frodo's concern over the potential redemption of Gollum and his refusal to give up hope on Gollum's redemption. So yeah, all of these things should, I hope, come in. If they do a good job, they will come into play in some really interesting ways in the new film. Yeah.
Two questions. One, do you think that we'll see them with the split of the two companies that own the rights to things?
Yeah.
Do you think we'll see either of them touch on things from the first age, like Ares creation or Narcos corruption or Fall with Silmarils? And which way would you want to see that go, as features or as serialized things in streaming?
Yeah.
And question two, something that's bothered me from the Lord of the Rings. We know that they had the ability to create the technology, so to speak, for things like fireworks and things like that, and yet Sauron making a bomb was seen as a really big deal. And I don't see how they couldn't have. How can you have one and nobody's done the other before? So, just if you explaining that in as a Tolkien scholar.
Yeah. Okay. Let me start with. I'll do the technology question second. Let's start with the. Wait, hang on a second. Remind me, what was the first question again? I've lost it.
Will we see either company do first age stories, and which way would you like to see that go?
Great. Okay. So, in the 60s, I believe, Tolkien sold the film rights to The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings while he was still alive. Why did he do this? He had grandkids to put through college. That's why he did this. His phrase, and people, again, I think of this phrase all the time when people, there were a lot of people, with the whole Prime Video thing, with the Rings of Power this past year, saying they're just doing this money grab, Tolkien would never approve. And I'm like, do you know what Tolkien's catchphrase was when he was talking to his publishers and stuff about the movie rights? Cash or control. That was what he said in his letter. I want cash or control. Either give me artistic control or lots of cash. Either one, you pick. And they went with cash. Can I also add, we are very fortunate indeed that the original people who were pitching to do adaptations of The Lord of the Rings did not do it in the 60s. Holy cow. So how many of you have seen Excalibur? The old early 80s film, Excalibur? Borman was pitching The Lord of the Rings. Excalibur was the project he did when he failed to get the Lord of the Rings contract. Well, so I can't even do justice to this. Let me just say, Borman's script included an intimate encounter between Frodo and, I defy you to guess.
Gollum?
Nope. Galadriel.
No!
I'm not even joking. Anyway, so we were spared much. But, so Tolkien sold those film rights in his lifetime. And to date, those are still the only film rights out. When Amazon Prime Video made their new deal before the Rings of Power, this was the item of intense speculation because they were very, very, very secretive. This is me speaking of the secretiveness of Prime Video in the past tense. That's hilarious. They are extremely secretive about that. But this was important because it was the first rights deal that was negotiated since the first movie deal that Tolkien himself made. And nobody knew, and nobody still knows, what is in it. Now, we've been told, like the showrunners have said and the Prime Video people have said, only the appendices, only the Hobbit Lord. Basically, it's the same. It's the same thing. Our first question was any Silmarillion included in this? And then what's the very first still that they released from the Rings of Power? Finrod standing in front of Tyrion upon Tuna with the two trees in the background, and we were like, all right, okay, that's suggestive, right? But they're like, no, we don't have Silmarillion rights, So, apparently, as far as we know, though I do not know any human being who has actually laid eyes upon the actual contract that they made with the Tolkien estate, the Prime Video people, as far as we know, the original film rights, like what was negotiated with Prime Video, was for the TV production of the original stuff, Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. Do I think we will see a new rights deal? Do I think that they will do? Yes, I do. I do think it will happen. Do I think the Tolkien estate is willing to sell? Yes. Now that Christopher is dead, yes, I do believe that they will be willing to sell. I think that the Tolkien estate is sitting back and watching developments and seeing what comes. I think probably in more than one sense. I would like to think that they're sitting back and saying, we want to see who has shown the greatest commitment to Tolkien's legacy and who is making the best and most artistic films that really capture the spirit and essence of Tolkien's world best. But yes, I see that, I suspect. But here's the thing. I think also they're being canny. Not just about who will pony up the most money for the rights if they put it on the market right now. I suspect anyway, that they're kind of waiting to see how this streaming TV versus feature film thing plays out. Is Amazon right to say that streaming TV is the way of the future and feature films are not going to be really because the Tolkien estate is going to have to choose whom they're going to sell it to. Which direction do they want it to go? So as far as the question of which one would I prefer to see, I personally agree with Amazon in terms of I really like streaming episodic TV. The ability to do long-form storytelling like that, I think fits the Silmarillion content way better. One mistake I think people often make about film adaptations. People think about, so movies are they're a huge deal, right? Like a feature film, it's a big, huge thing. So people look at,
Cleopatra,
right.
the Ten Commandments, NBC could have never done.
Yeah. So people look at books and they're like, okay, so novels, that's the big deal. Like you write a novel, that's a big deal in literature, right? And then they look at films and the feature film, that's the big deal. And so people tend to think that the novel and the feature film are kind of on a par. So you've got a great novel, people are like, okay, let's make a movie out of this great novel. But the novel is not the literary equivalent of the feature film. The short story is the literary equivalent of the feature film. You cannot tell a novel in a feature film without radically compressing it and enriching it, as many a film adaptation has demonstrated again and again. But if you take a short story like this one that they're doing and really dig into it, you can do that. You can make that work. So that's great for episodic stuff like this, and that's why I think this is such a great approach for this film and the films that will follow it. But for Silmarillion content, there are some stories. I think you could make a really excellent and enormously soul-crushingly depressing feature film of the Turin Turambar story. That would be a great, but horribly, they'd have to have, medical staff on hand. I mean, it would be really grim. But it would make a great movie. It would make, or maybe even a pair of movies or something like that. You could do, I think, a good Beren and Luthien movie, standalone Beren and Luthien movie. So it's possible that you could do some feature film treatment here. But if you really wanted to do the First Age. You really wanted to do the story of Beleriand. Absolutely, I would want to see that in an episodic treatment. Little fun kind of plug. When the Hobbit movies came out, I did a podcast series called Riddles in the Dark, where we were discussing, before the films came out, what adaptation choices Peter Jackson and crew were facing in the Hobbit films, and then we talked about what we thought they would do, and we thought what they should do, and then of course the films came out, and we were like, we liked our version of these movies that we had in our head better, than the ones that we saw on screen. So after that was over, I decided, a bunch of people who were doing Riddles in the Dark with me said, okay, let's do a new series where we think through Tolkien adaptation in the same way. But let's do this in a way that is untrammeled by reality, where we can't be disappointed. So we started what was called the Silmarillion Film Project. And what we started doing was planning out in detail an entirely theoretical television show, which would be a depiction of the Silmarillion from the Ainulindalë through the War of Wrath. And we've been doing it for 8 years now. We've been doing this. We're in season 6, which is the Baron Luthien season. We're just going to do this coming Thursday night. We'll be discussing the episode when Luthien dances before Morgoth and they cut the Silmaril from his crown. It's been a really cool season talking about Baron Luthien. So I've been involved in a sort of a combo scholarly creative project as we've been thinking through. It's been a fascinating approach to the Silmarillion material as well, thinking about it in this way. And so anyway, I certainly think that there could be some really interesting TV, and doing the whole scope of it and getting the entire epic run, we think it's going to take us at least 15 seasons to do the whole thing. But next season, join us for season 7, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. Oh yeah, oh yeah, and then Turin-Turin-Bar. But anyway, yeah. So it's. I think that would work much better. If you're going to do more than just pick out individual stories, I think it would be much better too. That's what I would rather see. Let me get back to the technology question in a second. Let me go ahead and get a question from you.
With your talk panel, do you think that it's a good choice for them to take short stories and use what's in the story so that if they add stuff into it, the purists can't go, well, that's not part of the lore.
Yeah.
Could that be part of their thinking?
In part, though, that hasn't stopped anybody from making those complaints about the Rings of Power, even when there is no lore that covered the things that they're talking about there, or even when they are using things that are there. So, I'm not going to protect them from something like that, but I do think that they're clearly interested in doing some fill-in-the-blanks stuff. There's a whole bunch of stuff they're going to have to invent, they're going to have to make up. And yet they are also telling a story that Tolkien did give the outline for. Like, we know how the story goes. We know the outline. Maybe they'll change that too. We'll see. But that's going to be, to me, that's going to be a fascinating comparison, to look at the relationship between this film and the text. It's such a different project to do this kind of fill-in-the-blank thing than it is to do a mere retelling of a very detailed story like the Lord of the Rings films. So it will be, I will be very interested to see. Back to the technology question. So it is unclear how Gandalf's fireworks work. To put it very simply, do Gandalf's fireworks have gunpowder in them? Right, that's sort of the question, right?
Basically, yeah.
Yeah, because if they did, then why is blowing stuff up strange, right? So, first of all, I don't think that if they did have gunpowder in them, there would be any kind of contradiction there. It's just, I don't think Gandalf clearly does not tell people how he makes fireworks. If he does know the recipe for gunpowder and makes his own gunpowder and puts them into fireworks, that wouldn't change anything about the reaction of people, even Aragorn, at the Battle of Helm's Deep when the wall blows up, right? They have brought a devilry from Orthanc, they say. That's how they characterize it, a devilry. It's some kind of magic. And by the way, in the book, it's not even clear whether it's, to what extent the explosion that Saruman does is technology or magic. The idea that it's technology, like that gets played up in the film, of course.
Well, that's why I went.
Yeah, exactly.
The Chinese, as I remember, didn't originally use gunpowder as explosives.
Yeah, no, the use of gunpowder in offensive warfare was not. Yeah, it was not its initial usage.
They're taking that example.
Exactly. So it is possible. It is. Either direction is actually possible from the text. It is possible that Gandalf also knows how to make gunpowder and uses that as fireworks. It's also possible that neither one of them, neither Saruman nor Gandalf, is making gunpowder. Tolkien is, as he is so often, just very silent on this point. We know what other people think when they see it, right? The hobbits certainly believe that the fireworks are magical, and based on what is described, magic must surely be involved. As howsoever good you are in designing fireworks, you're not going to be able to create the effect that Gandalf clearly does create, right? Just as howsoever good you are at blowing smoke rings, you're not going to be able to blow smoke rings that travel around the room, find other smoke rings, and go through them, as he describes in The Hobbit, Gandalf's smoke rings doing, right? And then returning to him and orbiting his head at the end, until he has this whole cloud of orbital smoke rings around his head in Bilbo's parlor in chapter 1, right? That's also not normal. Does that mean it's magic smoke? Tolkien almost never describes how magic works, and so that's really unclear. But certainly the use of, there are places where Tolkien really emphasizes the use of technology. And one of the big places where we see that is Numenor. The Isle of Numenor is technologically advanced, and some of that survives into the Lord of the Rings. Why is it that that Orthanc, the Tower of Orthanc, can't be damaged? Where the Ents who can pull down the stone walls and burrow through the stone walls can't harm the walls of Orthanc. It's not because it's magical. There's a technological, the Numenorians built it, and they had some kind of, is it a metallurgical technique? Is it, we don't know, right? Because it's been lost, right? From the framework of the story, of the Lord of the Rings storytellers, they have no idea. But we know that the Numenorians had technology far beyond. And in the earliest versions of the Numenor story, very far beyond. They had airplanes and steamships. And when Ar-Pharazôn goes to invade Valinor, the reason the Valar throw up their hands and say, Iluvatar, could you sort this out? Is that Ar-Pharazôn's fleet was just about to carpet bomb Valinor with airplanes. And even that reference that survives in the published Silmarillion about how the Numenorian army surrounds Tolaresia, and the sea was obscured by the sails of their ships, it says in the published Silmarillion. But in the original version, it was the smoke from their steamships that was obscuring the sky around them. He backs off from that. Why does Sauron's entire army just run away when Ar-Pharazôn's army lands in Middle-earth? Because they had cannon, is why. They opened up a barrage, and the orcs were like, we are so out of here, right? That's why nobody could even get on the same field with the Numenorians. But hey, Tolkien dialed that back. He decided, no airplanes, no steamships, no artillery, just like really, really good bows and, really, really good, and advanced metallurgy and advanced, architectural techniques and things like that. But even on that level, they had superior technology. So, but that survives within the framework of the storytellers of the Lord of the Rings in ways that look like magic and they don't understand it. So,
See, I always took Saruman's bomb as like the shock and awe that it caused. I always took that as like the nail on the head of Tolkien's hatred for industrialization, and that was the fine point on the issue.
Yeah, Tolkien is not a big fan of the march of technology and of industrialization in particular. I'm going to talk, I think it's on Sunday, which talk I'm giving on which day. The talk I'm giving on Tolkien and the environment, I'm going to be talking a good deal more about his relationship with industrialization and environmental issues. So we can talk about that another time. Thanks everybody for joining me, and I'll be back tomorrow. We'll be talking about video games, video game adaptations, and other stuff tomorrow. So
and annotated reading.
Yes, and annotated reading, absolutely. Yeah, we'll do some Tolkien reading together tomorrow. So thanks everybody for joining me.